My name is Clara Harwood, and the first time I realized I'd been erased from my own daughter's story was on national television. She was standing at a podium dressed in a sharp cream pantsuit, thanking everyone from her high school English teacher to her current CFO. Cameras flashed, the crowd applauded, and when the reporter asked her afterward about her upbringing, she laughed lightly and said, "I was raised by strong women in the business world. Mentors really, no mention of me. Not one." So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because this isn't just a story about a mother and a daughter. It's about how a single omission, just one, can echo louder than a slap. And how silence, when chosen carefully, can be the sharpest blade of all. It started with the promotion. Isabel had worked for it. I won't deny that. She was a driven woman, intense, methodical, articulate. Everything she was, I had once prayed she would become. When she told me she'd been named Senior Regional Director of Finance at her firm, I clapped my hands like a child, genuinely happy for her. "Oh, darling, that's incredible," I said on the phone, standing in my kitchen with tea gone cold on the counter. "Let me take you out to celebrate anywhere you want." There was a pause. It lasted just slightly too long. "I'll be too busy this month, Mom." "You know how it is. Launch meetings, press onboarding, a new team. But I'll send you some pictures." Some pictures. A week later, I received a generic bouquet from a delivery service. White lilies. No note. I placed them in water as always. Flowers deserve that much even if the sender forgets the why. The next few weeks became a blur of one-sided conversations. I'd text good luck with the rollout. She'd reply hours later, "Thanks. Super busy. Hope all's well." I asked if she wanted to come by for Sunday lunch, our old tradition. She said she was trying to cut back on carbs. I sent her a photo of my cat curled up in her old bedroom. She responded with a laughing emoji and a single word, "Cute." It was like talking to a glass door. You can see through it, but you're not allowed in. The final break came oddly with a birthday. Not hers, mine. She used to make a whole day of it when she was younger. Even during her broke college years, she'd wake up early to make me pancakes, leave me sticky notes around the house that said things like, "You're my constant," or "Thanks for every tired night you carried me through." But this year, a forwarded email from an assistant, subject, "Happy birthday from Isabel Harwood's office." Inside, a pre-written message and a discount code for a wellness spa 3 towns over. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or cry. I did neither. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea, set it on the table across from me, and pretended she was still there, twirling her hair, stealing sips from my cup, telling me about colleagues she secretly hated. But the steam faded, and the silence became a mirror. Later that evening, I found myself pulling an old fireproof box from beneath my bed. It was heavy locked, layered in dust and hesitation. Inside, every receipt, every tuition invoice, every co-signed loan form from her undergrad and MBA years. Most of them still bore my shaky signature at the bottom. Some had smudges, tea stains, even tears. I had once begged her to let me take a personal loan instead of asking the university for hardship grants. She never knew that I'd canceled my health insurance during her final semester just to make ends meet. When I say I gave her everything, I don't mean it metaphorically. I mean I literally gave her everything. My savings, my credit, my breath. And now, I was just a polite old woman with soft hands and no place in her version of success. I didn't confront her. That's not who I am. I grew up in a generation where mothers held their disappointment like rosary beads, turning them over in silence, hoping the prayers would be heard without being spoken. But that night, I opened a blank Word document. I typed 3 words. "You forgot me." Then I deleted them. Then I typed again. "You cut me out." But I'm still the outline. I saved the file, named it Final Draft. The next morning, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't fight for space in someone else's success story. I'd start writing mine. 2 weeks passed before I heard from her again. Not a call, not even a proper message. Just a forwarded digital article. The title read, "Finance Trailblazer, Isabel Harwood on Rising from the Bottom to the Boardroom." There she was on the cover head, tilted just slightly, arms crossed confidently in a tailored cobalt blue suit, the city skyline soft in the background. She looked powerful, poised, like someone who had wrestled her life into shape with nothing but grit and intellect. And then I read the interview. I grew up in a very independent environment, she had said. There weren't many safety nets. But that made me resilient. I learned how to rely on my own drive. There it was again, this strange erasure. Not cruelty, but something colder. The quiet revision of a story. I wasn't asking for credit. I didn't want a public thank you, a glossy quote. But it stung more than I expected. Not because of what she said, but because of everything she left out. That afternoon, I walked into town. It was a gray day. Clouds like wool hung low, and the bookstore on Main had that familiar scent of old paper and rain-wet carpet. I found myself wandering into the back corner, the one where biographies sat with spines cracked by other people's memories. My friend Judith was working behind the counter. She looked up, smiled. "Haven't seen you in a bit, Clara. Everything okay?" I hesitated, then shrugged. "Depends which chapter you're asking about." She gave a soft chuckle, then came around the desk. "Tea's on. Sit for a minute." We did. There's something about sitting beside someone who knows your silences that makes them easier to carry. I told her not everything, but enough. About the emails, the distance, the interviews where I didn't exist. About the way Isabel's success now seemed to depend on pretending she raised herself. Judith didn't gasp, didn't scold. She just listened. Then said one sentence I hadn't let myself think aloud. "She's not ashamed of you, Clara. She's ashamed of owing anyone." That night, I opened the fireproof box again. This time, I laid it all out. Receipts, statements, payment plans, the deferred health policy I'd let lapse when Isabel needed books for her summer term. Every paper a piece of bone I had lent her, not out of obligation but love. I kept turning them over like tarot cards, wondering what they foretold. And that's when I found it. A loan application from her second year at university, where the guarantor section had been signed and initialed twice, once by me, once by the university officer. I remember that day. I had come from a 12-hour hospital shift, changed clothes in the restroom, and walked across campus in shoes too tight because I couldn't afford new ones. I had stood in a glass office while Isabel looked away embarrassed as I signed my name beneath a debt she wouldn't carry. I pressed the page flat with both hands. It felt like holding a contract written in invisible ink. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my bank. No, not to withdraw anything. Just to update the names on a few documents, quiet changes, the kind no one notices until it's too late. I then booked an appointment with an attorney I'd once used for estate planning. Her name was Kelsey, young, sharp, respectful. She'd grown up in town, remembered me from her school days. "You helped with the scholarship fund for my sister," she said as we sat down. I nodded. I hadn't remembered that, but it reminded me giving had always been my instinct. It wasn't weakness. It was choice. As I signed the new documents, modifications to my willpower of attorney updates, revised asset transfers, Kelsey paused. "May I ask, why the changes?" I looked at her for a long time. Then I said simply, "Because some debts weren't just financial, they were moral." She understood. She didn't ask again. That evening, I didn't wait for a call from Isabel. I didn't check her social media. I didn't hover in the digital corners of her life looking for traces of warmth or leftover affection. Instead, I made a quiet dinner. Lentil soup, rosemary bread, a glass of chilled white wine. I sat at my table, unfolded a linen napkin, and imagined what she might say one day if she ever found herself without the people who now adored her title more than her story. If that day ever came, well, she'd know where to find the truth. Filed away, stamped, paid in full. A week later, Isabel called me. It wasn't out of sentiment or longing. It was logistical. "Hey, Mom," she said, breathless, as though she'd just remembered I existed. "Can I forward you something? It's for a tax verification. They just need confirmation of the student loans, and I think your name is still listed somewhere." Still listed. Somewhere. I swallowed my reply. "Of course," I said. "Send it over." She did. Within minutes, I received a thick PDF attachment. Her new financial advisor needed clarification on which education loans had been paid and by whom. The form was simple enough, but what caught me off guard was a short note at the top. We're applying for a first home buyer bonus based on independent status. All debts must reflect applicant's self-paid journey. Ah, I stared at that line. Self-paid journey. How interesting. How beautifully revisionist. I took a pen and slowly began to annotate the document. Line by line, loan by loan. Every monthly payment, mine. Every co-signature, mine. Every emergency tuition deposit when her scholarships were delayed. You guessed it, but I didn't just list amounts. I listed dates. I included receipts from the years when my electric bill was paid 5 days late, so hers could be paid 5 days early. When I was done, I saved the document as Truth, revised by Mother, PDF, and then I sent it back. No reply that night. Or the next. Then a message. Wow, that was a lot of detail. I didn't realize you still had all that. No apology, no thank you. Just discomfort disguised as detachment. So I responded simply, neither did I. But you asked. That Sunday, I walked to the small church in town not to attend service, but to sit on the bench in the garden behind it. It had been my thinking spot for years, a place of rustling leaves, old stone angels, and silent memory. There, I found Father Dunn, a man who'd known me since Isabel was in pigtails and spelling bees. He was watering a patch of withered lilies. I sat beside him. You look like someone who's rewriting a prayer, he said gently. I'm erasing one, I replied, and maybe replacing it with something stronger. He didn't ask what. He just waited. I told him quietly about everything. The calls that stopped, the birthdays forgotten, the radio interviews where I was reduced to a complex childhood or independently raised. When I finished, I didn't cry. I just exhaled. She has a different story in her head, I said. He nodded. And now it's time you write yours. That night, I opened a fresh document. At the top, I typed, what she never knew. And I began writing not out of bitterness, but to finally speak aloud what motherhood cost when it wasn't reimbursed with love. I wrote about the hospital nights, the cold dinners, the silent heart murmurs I ignored until the scholarships cleared. I wrote about the power company representative who once let me pay in 2 installments, whispering, I hope she gets that degree, ma'am. And I wrote about the year I wore the same shoes through 3 seasons. They had cracks in the soles, but I stuffed them with napkins on rainy days. No one ever noticed. She never asked. 2 days later, I received a voicemail. Mom, that PDF. It's really a lot. I'm not trying to downplay everything you've done. There was a pause. Can we not make this a thing? I'm really under a lot of pressure. And this feels like emotional accounting. She said it lightly, but I heard the tremor beneath. Emotional accounting. Is that what love was now? I didn't respond. I forwarded the voicemail to my email and saved it. Labeled it Emotional Hard Accounting 01. Wave. If she was building a story, then I would keep the archive. Later that week, I donated my wedding ring. It had sat in a velvet box for years, unused since my husband died. I had once considered passing it to Isabel, but now it felt like handing a candle to someone who never sits in the dark. Instead, I gave it to a local foundation that provided emergency scholarships for single mothers trying to finish school. The director, a young woman with tired eyes and a grateful smile, held it with reverence. This will help more than you know, she whispered. I nodded. Trust me, I said. I do know. A few days after I gave away my wedding ring, a large cream envelope arrived in my mailbox. The return address was a high-rise office tower in the city, the kind where the lobby echoes your footsteps, and everyone wears the same shade of ambition. Inside, an invitation, heavy cardstock, gold-embossed lettering. The 24th Annual Women in Finance Leadership Gala. Honoring Isabel Harwood, Trailblazer of the Year. Location: the Hawthorne Grand Ballroom. RSVP required. Dress code: formal elegance. I held it in my hands and let the weight of it settle. It was beautiful, cold, like a snowflake preserved under glass. There was no handwritten note, not even a hope to see you there. I wasn't sure if she sent it to be polite, or to be untraceable. But I knew one thing for certain. I would go. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully, not to impress, not to be seen, but to feel like myself. I wore a charcoal gray dress, one I'd tailored myself from an old pattern decades ago. Over it, a silk shawl with a delicate thread of navy, pearl earrings small and silent, a simple clutch bag, no perfume, no expectation. As I looked in the mirror, I didn't see someone left behind. I saw the woman who had been there from the beginning, the late-night tutor, the silent guarantor, the hospital accountant who once balanced 16 patient charts and Isabel's tuition bill in the same afternoon, the woman who raised a CEO from coupons and casseroles. The ballroom was vast and glittering, filled with sleek people clinking glasses and laughing too loudly. I arrived quietly, checking in under my own name. Not Isabel Harwood's mother, just Clara. That name had weight even if no one in the room knew it. I found a small table near the back, away from the spotlight. A waiter offered champagne. I declined. I wanted to be clear-eyed, present, watching. Then the lights dimmed. A spotlight bloomed on the podium, and there she was, Isabel. She walked out in a deep emerald gown that shimmered as she moved. The crowd erupted in applause. She raised her hand modestly, head bowed, all humility and poise. She began her speech, voice steady. I was raised by strong mentors, women who showed me how to keep going when things got hard. I didn't come from privilege, but I came from grit, and I turned that grit into grace. There it was again, grit into grace. And not a word about the woman who had scrubbed her own hands raw just to afford that grit. I didn't flinch, not this time, because I hadn't come to be remembered. I came to remember myself. When the applause died down and people turned to their desserts, I rose quietly, walked to the exit, and left before the final toast. Outside, the night was brisk and clean. I walked 3 blocks in heels I hadn't worn in 10 years and felt every step like punctuation. At the corner, a young woman was waiting for a ride share. She looked at me and smiled. "Excuse me," she said. "I loved your speech tonight." I blinked. "Mine." She hesitated, embarrassed. "Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were the woman who started that scholarship program. The Silverline Foundation." I paused, then smiled. "No," I said softly, "but I gave them something better. I gave them the reason they exist." She didn't understand, but it didn't matter. Not everyone needs to hear the truth for it to remain true. When I got home, I poured a cup of tea, sat by the window, let the night settle in. Then I opened my file again, what she never knew, and I added a new line. Tonight she spoke about mentors, but she forgot the first one. The woman who taught her how to fill out her first bank form, how to tie a scarf without a mirror, how to apologize without saying but. I saved the file, but I didn't send it. Not yet. Some truths deserve an audience, and some only need a witness. The morning after the gala, I received a phone call from Isabel, not a text, not an email, an actual phone call. My phone buzzed once and then again. Her name lit up the screen like an aftershock. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, my voice even unreadable. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to feel rehearsed. "Mom? Hey," she said, forcing cheer. "I didn't know you were at the gala." "You sent me the invitation," I replied gently. Another pause. "Well, yes, but I didn't think you'd actually come." Her tone wasn't cruel, just careless, as if she had built her world in such a way that my presence no longer naturally belonged. I sipped my tea. I wanted to see what grit turned into. She didn't laugh. She cleared her throat. "I hope you weren't uncomfortable or anything." "Oh no," I said. I was quite comfortable. The truth always is. There it was again. The discomfort behind her silence. My words were too smooth, too precise. She wasn't used to me being composed, used to guilt slipping past me like rain on an open umbrella. But I wasn't holding one anymore. I had let the rain fall, and now I was dry. I just wanted to say, she continued, that I'm under a lot of scrutiny at work. The PR team is really focused on shaping the right message. That's why I don't always bring up, personal stuff. Personal stuff, I repeated. Yes, like our history. It's not that I don't appreciate what you did. People don't need the full backstory all the time. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. I understand, Isabel. Everyone wants to tell their story. Some just prefer the edited version. She was quiet again. Then she added too quickly, I mean, you didn't seem upset. You left before I could find you. I left when the speech ended, I said. I'd heard what I needed to. She didn't ask what that was. Later that afternoon, I took a walk around the block. The air cool and damp, as if the sky itself had decided to keep its distance. I passed a bakery I used to take her to when she was a child. She would press her nose to the glass, pointing at lemon tarts and sticky buns, eyes wide with longing. I almost never said no, even when we had to split one tart 3 ways. Even when I had skipped breakfast so she wouldn't have to skip dessert. She used to say, "You're magic, Mom." And I used to believe it. Now, I was invisible. That night, I opened the email draft I'd never sent. The one labeled What She Never Knew. I reread it from top to bottom. There were no insults, no dramatics, just pages of truth, sacrifices, receipts, choices. A quiet chronicle of a mother's love written in silence and soft margins. At the end, I added one more sentence. Your success is not the problem. Your forgetfulness is. Then I closed the laptop, got into bed, and for the first time in months, slept through the night without waking once. The following week, I met with my lawyer again. Kelsey greeted me with that same professional warmth. Ready to finalize everything? She asked. I nodded. The final version of my will had been rewritten. Donations redirected, titles reassigned, a letter attached. Not a vengeful letter, just the truth. I'm not trying to punish her, I told Kelsey. I'm just making sure the next woman who comes after me doesn't have to carry this weight alone. She smiled. I think that's the most loving kind of justice. I signed the final page, and with it, a life's work was no longer unclaimed. On my way out of the building, I passed a woman in her 30s arguing with someone on the phone. I don't owe her anything, she snapped. She raised me, sure. But that was her job. I didn't stop walking. But inside I whispered, no, darling. It was her choice. And you never asked what it cost. Isabel didn't call again for a while. Not after the gala. Not after the call where she fumbled to justify forgetting me with phrases like PR framing and our history. Not after I replied with nothing but silence. And maybe that was the loudest answer I could give. But silence has a way of creating echoes, ones we don't expect. Because then came the voicemail. It arrived late one evening, just after dinner, when the sky outside my kitchen window was painted in deep velvet. Hi, Mom. I guess you're busy. I just wanted to check in. I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us. I'm sorry if I made you feel unappreciated. That wasn't my intention. There was a pause, and I could hear her breathing. I know you gave up a lot. I didn't think you'd keep all those records. I didn't realize you remembered it all that clearly. Another breath. Shaky this time. Anyway, I'm sorry. Maybe we can talk soon. I didn't delete the message, but I didn't return it either. Because here's the truth. I hadn't remembered it all clearly. I had remembered it all painfully. That's the difference. She thought it was about memory. It was about cost. 2 days later, I found myself in the attic. It had been years since I'd gone up there, where the air was dry and smelled of dust and insulation. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just chasing a feeling, I suppose. That's when I found the blue box, an old cardboard file container sealed with twine. On the front, in my handwriting, faded but still legible, Isabel, school years. Inside were drawings from kindergarten, stick figures with wobbly crowns, a spelling test with extraordinary written correctly at age 9, a faded photo of her in braces holding a trophy from a math competition, a birthday card she once made from a folded paper plate with the words, "Mom, you're the reason I know what smart looks like." I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, the light from the narrow window falling just right, and let myself cry. Not because of what I'd lost, but because of what we'd once had. I spent the next few hours sorting what to keep and what to let go. Some things I realized weren't meant to be saved in boxes. Some truths needed to be passed on, not in storage, but in legacy. That night, I wrote a new letter, not to Isabel, to the scholarship foundation I'd recently included in my will. Please create a new award in honor of those who gave quietly. Name it the First Mentor Grant, for women who raised others before they were ever thanked. This is not a memorial. It's a mirror. Let the recipients look into it and know someone somewhere understands what they gave up and will not let it be forgotten. A few days later, I received an email from the foundation director. Clara, this will be our most personal award yet. We'll share it at the winter gala. And yes, we'll call it the first mentor. She added, would you like to write a few words for the announcement? Or, come read it yourself? I didn't reply immediately. I closed the email and looked out the window where the trees had started turning gold at the tips. Fall was arriving, and with it a quiet reckoning. That evening, I walked to the mailbox just before dusk. Inside was a card. Thick handwritten, from Isabel. Mom, I've been thinking, would you want to come see the new office sometime? I could take you to lunch afterward. Just us. I miss you. I just don't always know how to say it right. I held the card for a long while. Then I slid it into the same drawer where I'd placed my will. Not to hide it. To remember. Some gestures arrive late. But that doesn't mean they're empty. Still, I didn't call her back that night. I needed time. Because forgiveness isn't a door. It's a path. And I was just beginning to walk mine. The next week passed with silence, but not the painful kind. This one was softer. Still, the sort of silence that allows things to settle into place like dust after a storm, or memories finding their proper shelves. I spent those days tending to my small garden. The late autumn roses were fading, their petals crisping at the edges. I trimmed them anyway, humming a lullaby I used to sing to Isabel when she was small and feverish and couldn't sleep. She once asked me at 7 years old, "Do moms ever stop loving?" And I had whispered, "Only if they forget how much it hurt to start." She fell asleep in my arms that night. Now, all these years later, that same girl had written me a card, tentative reaching. I hadn't answered yet, and I still wasn't sure if I would. One morning, while sorting through a box of old bank records, I came across a photograph tucked inside a deposit receipt. It must have slipped in accidentally. It was taken the day Isabel received her acceptance letter to university. She was standing on the porch, letter in hand, her eyes wild with joy. I was beside her, smiling but tired. I looked closely at my expression. It was a kind of joy that carried bruises beneath it. Joy tempered by exhaustion. That was the cost no one saw. That was the picture I wished she remembered. I was folding laundry later that day when the doorbell rang. Through the glass, I saw a young woman holding a tablet. She wore a blazer and a nervous smile. "Miss Harwood?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm from Stanton and Rose Media. We're producing a documentary series on women behind great women, mentors, mothers, teachers. Your name came up from the Silverline Foundation." She shifted, unsure. "Would you consider being interviewed?" I stared at her. "A film. My story." I almost declined. After all, I wasn't the kind who gave interviews. I was the one who packed sandwiches in silence while someone else gave the speech. But then I thought of the first mentor grant, of the email from the director, of Isabel's voice in that voicemail cracking slightly around the edges, and I said yes. The interview was held in a small studio 2 weeks later. I wore my navy shawl again, the same one I had worn to Isabel's gala. The producer asked soft questions about sacrifice, about raising a child on one income, about the things we give up that no one ever writes down. "Did she thank you?" she asked once. I hesitated, then smiled gently. "She did," I said, "in ways she didn't realize." After the interview, they handed me a small check, a token honorarium, they called it. I donated it, in Isabel's name, not out of sarcasm, but because I needed that gesture to live somewhere beyond myself. Forgiveness isn't a grand declaration. Sometimes it's just a line item in your own soul's budget, a quiet expense with no need for applause. The next weekend, Isabel called again. This time I picked up. "Hi, Mom," she said, a little breathless. I saw the documentary teaser. The part about packing sandwiches?" I remembered. "I used to eat the crusts first because you liked the middle." I smiled. "You remembered that." "I forgot a lot of things," she said, then paused. "But I'm trying to unforget." That landed somewhere deep inside me. She invited me to lunch again. This time I said yes. We met at a small place halfway between her office and my home. Not expensive, not performative. Just two women at a table passing bread and glances and slowly rediscovering the language of old love. We didn't talk about the gala. We didn't talk about the inheritance or the loan files or the documents I'd rewritten. We talked about tomato soup, her cat, my aching knees, whether the barista was flirting or just polite. And in between the small talk, I caught a glimpse of something bigger. Not a daughter trying to make amends, but a woman trying to look back at her mother and finally see her whole. Not as a stepping stone, but as the ground itself. After that lunch, something shifted. Not dramatically, not the sweeping arc of a film where tears fall and arms open and everything heals in one neat scene, but gently, like ice beginning to melt in the quiet corners of a garden that had long stopped expecting spring. Isabel began calling every Sunday, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 20. She never said I'm sorry directly again, but the small details began to speak for her. She asked about the herbs I grew in my windowsill. She remembered I don't like lemon in my tea. She sent a photo of an old journal she'd found in her attic, her first one apparently. The cover was pink and peeling with a sticker that read, "Top Secret Thoughts." Inside, she'd written at age 12, "My mom is the smartest woman I know. She keeps everything together even when she's tired. When I grow up, I'll make her proud and buy her a house." I smiled at that. She never did buy me a house. But for the first time in a long time, I no longer needed her to. I had built one for myself inside me. One made of dignity, resolve, and memory that no one could evict. One Sunday, her call came a little earlier than usual. "Mom," she said softly, "I've been thinking about Christmas." I braced myself. The last holiday had been a quiet wound. She hadn't come, hadn't called, had posted a photo of herself skiing in Colorado with colleagues. The caption had read, "Chosen family hits different," but now her voice carried something different. Hesitant, hopeful. "I was wondering if you'd want to come to my place this year. I mean, if you're up for it?" There was a pause. "I don't know if it'll feel the same as it used to, but I'd like to try again. Try again. Not start over. Not a race. Just try again." I told her I'd think about it, and I did. For 3 full days, I walked through old memories like rooms I hadn't opened in years. The kitchen where I taught her how to make bread pudding. The back porch where we'd danced barefoot in summer storms. The hospital parking lot where I sat for hours, afraid to call anyone when I got the diagnosis I later kept secret. And then I thought of the moments she had quietly shown up lately. Her asking questions about my past. Forwarding the scholarship launch with a note that read, "This is beautiful. You were the original mentor. I hope you know that." I called her on the 4th day. "I'll come," I said. "If I can bring the stuffing." She laughed. A sound that almost made my eyes sting. "Only if it's the one with raisins," she said. I smiled. "It always is." The holidays arrived faster than I expected. I wrapped a small gift for her. A framed photo of that porch moment from the acceptance letter day. The one where I looked exhausted but deeply proud. I didn't write anything on the back. Just let the image speak. She greeted me at the door in slippers and a loose sweater. The apartment was warm, quiet, undecorated in the way that said, "I didn't know how to make this feel like home." But when she hugged me, it wasn't brief or polite. It was long, full, and real. We ate on the couch with mismatched plates and a Christmas movie playing in the background. She didn't say much, neither did I. But halfway through the evening, she said without looking at me, "You never really cut me off." Even when I did, I didn't respond. Some truths don't need echoes. Before I left that night, she handed me a small envelope. Not fancy, no gold print. Inside was a single page. It was a transfer of ownership for a small scholarship she'd created at her alma mater. The name, the Clara Harwood Resilience Grant. For the women who held it together when no one saw the cost. I looked up at her. Her voice was quiet. "You shouldn't just live in the footnotes." And for the first time in years, I believed she saw me. Not as a cautionary tale, not as a silent support beam, but as the first chapter. After the holidays, things didn't magically transform. There were still days when Isabel forgot to call, or when her tone slipped into that polished professionalism she couldn't quite turn off. But there was something new now, something we hadn't shared in years. Effort, and more importantly, the awareness of effort. In January, I received a parcel. No card. No occasion. Just a carefully wrapped box inside which lay a book. It was a limited edition hardcover of The Price of Loyalty by Dr. Marianne Easton, a financial ethics professor Isabel used to adore. Inside the front cover was a post-it note. Chapter 12 made me think of you. I think I finally understand. I flipped to chapter 12. It was titled, Invisible Investors. It opened with this quote: "Some of the greatest contributions to success are not measured in dollars or recognition, but in the quiet, unpaid hours of someone who believed in you before the data did." My throat caught. I didn't call her immediately. I wanted the moment to land without needing to be applauded. That's what so much of our relationship had been. Her performing success and me clapping from the dark. But now she was starting to light the aisle. A week later, she invited me to speak at a panel. Not on stage, not with cameras, just as part of a closed leadership circle for new recruits at her company. She said, "We're doing a series on legacy, on gratitude. I thought you could share something about investing in someone without expecting a return." It felt like the smallest olive branch in the world, and the most honest. I said yes, but I told her I would only speak once. She agreed. The conference room was smaller than I imagined. No stage, just chairs, a projector, coffee cups, people half my age. Isabel introduced me, briefly, but there was softness in her voice now. A little crack near the end when she said, "She's the reason I even know how to balance anything numbers or otherwise." I stood, spoke for about 10 minutes. I didn't tell them about the hospital pay cuts, or the pawn shop, or the year I went without new glasses so she could study abroad. I told them this: you'll meet people in your life who give you things you won't recognize as valuable until decades later. Time, belief, unquestioned loyalty. You might forget to say thank you. You might forget they were there at all. But if you're lucky, and I mean truly lucky, you'll get the chance to remember them before they're gone. Take it." The room was silent. Then someone in the back clapped, slowly. Then all of them. I looked at Isabel. She didn't clap. She cried. Afterward, she hugged me in front of everyone. Not the stiff business casual hug I'd seen her give donors and executives, but the kind you can't fake. The kind you remember years later in rooms that feel too quiet. On the train ride home, I thought about legacy, not in terms of money or awards or scholarships, but in impact. In the way people carry your presence long after they've left your house. In how your words echo back through choices they make. Sometimes poorly, sometimes late, but still because of you. That night, I wrote a final entry in my digital file, "What She Never Knew." And I changed the name. I renamed it, "What She Finally Saw." And I added this at the end: not all debts need to be repaid. Some just need to be acknowledged. And that, too, is a kind of justice. A few weeks after the leadership panel, I found myself in the kitchen rearranging the spice rack. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where nothing demands your time. I had just placed the cumin beside the paprika when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Isabel stood there. No assistant. No car idling at the curb. No carefully timed exit strategy. Just her, in jeans, an oversized cardigan, and eyes that looked more daughter than executive. "I was in the neighborhood," she said. I smiled. "You live 40 miles away." She gave a soft laugh. "Okay." "I wasn't in the neighborhood, but I needed to see you." I stepped aside. "Then come in." She wandered to the kitchen, picked up the tin of tea I always kept for her. "You still drink chamomile?" she asked. "Only on days I don't want to remember too much." She nodded, then quietly set 2 mugs on the table. For a few minutes we sat in silence stirring our tea. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "I read the full version of your file." I looked up. She continued, "The one on your computer." What she finally saw? "I found it on the flash drive you gave me last year when you were cleaning out the attic." I blinked. I had forgotten that. At the time, I handed it to her absent-mindedly, thinking it was just family photos and tax returns. But no. Apparently, I had left my quiet archive in her hands. "Did it upset you?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, it humbled me." She reached into her bag and pulled out a sheet of paper. Typed, Clean. Folded once. I wrote something, she said. Would you read it? I unfolded the page. At the top, it said, "To the woman I forgot to name, you didn't raise me with money, but with the memory of making it count. You didn't build me with status, but with sacrifice you never asked credit for." I called myself self-made. But that was a myth I used to survive discomfort. The truth is, I was made in your image, in your silence, in your sweat, in your ability to carry shame that was never yours. I don't want to build without you anymore. I want to rebuild with you seen. I looked up, throat tight. She met my eyes. You don't have to say anything. But I did. I forgive you, I whispered. But not because you earned it. Because I wanted peace more than I wanted proof. She nodded, tears in her eyes. That's what makes you better than me, she said. I took her hand. No, Isabel, that's what makes me your mother. We spent the rest of the afternoon making bread, just like we used to. I let her knead the dough while I gave advice she didn't ask for, correcting her technique with a raised eyebrow and a chuckle. She rolled her eyes but smiled the whole time. When it came out of the oven golden and imperfect, she looked at me and said, "Maybe one day I'll be able to do this without your help." I tore off a piece. Maybe, I said, but I'll still be here, in the crust. That night, as she left, she turned back at the door. "I'm thinking of starting a mentorship program for young women in finance," she said. "I want to name the inaugural grant after you." I tilted my head. "Clara Harwood is already taken." She smiled. I was thinking, the Quiet Architect Fund, for the ones who built the house, not the plaque. I nodded slowly. "That name," I said, "sounds just right." When the door closed behind her, I sat in my chair, wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, and let the silence settle in again. But this time, it didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like applause. Spring arrived with soft winds and a bloom of white magnolias outside my window. I found myself lingering by the open curtains more often, watching life happen. Watching birds stitch nests from things discarded. It reminded me of how we rebuild. Not with fresh pieces, but with the ones others overlook. That season, Isabel began to visit regularly. Sometimes with groceries. Sometimes with nothing but herself and stories about work, people, the small tragedies of corporate life that no longer impressed her as much. One day, while folding laundry in the living room, she said, "You know, I've been thinking about the phrase, self-made. I used to wear it like a badge. Now it feels like a blindfold." I glanced up from my stack of towels. She wasn't looking at me, just staring at her folded hands. "I said it so many times I started to believe it," she continued. "And then I realized it was a way to pretend I owed no one. That I had to owe no one because owing meant weakness." I stayed silent. But now she said softly, "I know the truth. I wasn't self-made. I was mother-made." I set the towels down and reached across to take her hand. "You don't owe me your success," I said, "but you owe yourself the truth." That weekend she invited me to her new office. It was a corner suite, sleek and modern, glass walls that captured the skyline. The desk was spotless, the kind of tidy that signals power. On the wall behind her chair hung a framed mission statement. But something on the shelf caught my eye. It was the framed photo I had given her, the one from her university acceptance day, me beside her, on the porch, tired and proud. It stood between two awards right at eye level. She noticed me noticing. "I moved it here last week," she said. "Didn't feel right keeping it at home anymore. It belongs where I make decisions." I walked over, touched the edge of the frame with one finger. "I still remember that day," I murmured. "You said, 'This letter proves I'm smart.' And I said, 'You were smart long before a school agreed with you.'" She smiled. "I don't think I ever believed that until recently." Later, we had lunch on the office terrace. She told me about the mentorship program, the Quiet Architect Fund. Applications were opening soon, and she had insisted on a review process that favored resilience over resume polish. I asked who would choose the final recipients. "I will," she said, "but only after I read their stories twice. Once as a CEO, once as a daughter." That evening, as I was preparing to leave, she handed me an envelope. "Before you go," she said, "I want you to have this." Inside was a letter handwritten. "Mom, I know I can't rewrite the past. I know I can't repay the nights you went without, or the days you smiled through worry, but I can start naming you. In every speech, in every scholarship, in every moment I once claimed alone. You're not my shadow. You're the shape that made me. At the bottom was a postscript. P.S. I've finally started adding your name to the story. I hope you'll keep reading. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Because this was the chapter where things didn't end, but simply settled. Where the story stopped circling grief and began to grow toward grace. Back home, I lit a candle by the window and wrote one final line in my private file. She remembered. And that was enough. Then I clicked save. Then close. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a footnote. I felt like a chapter title. The mentorship program launched in early summer. Isabel asked me to attend the inaugural ceremony, not as a guest, not as a silent donor, but as the keynote speaker. I said yes, not because I needed the applause, but because I wanted to look those young women in the eyes and remind them they weren't invisible. Not to me, not anymore. The venue wasn't grand, but it was warm sunlight streamed in through tall windows, and the air carried that fragile optimism only new beginnings can hold. There were no cameras, no media, just folding chairs, name tags, and a small podium bearing a single word in silver foil: mentor. I stood behind it and looked out at a room filled with future leaders, some barely 20, others already. Mothers, all of them carrying dreams too big for their current wallets. I began with this. There are people in this world who will tell you they built themselves. But behind every success story, there's someone who gave quietly, not for applause, not for credit, but because they believed in you before the world had a reason to. I paused, scanning the room. A few eyes welled with tears. One young woman pressed her hand to her chest. You don't owe them your future, I said. But you do owe them a truth. They mattered. So say their names out loud in full. Don't let their sacrifices become silent currency. After the ceremony, several attendees approached me. They didn't ask for advice. They simply said thank you, then began telling me their own first mentors. A grandmother who cleaned houses at dawn. An older sister who skipped university so the younger one could go. A neighbor who taught her how to tie a tie because her father never stayed. Stories like ripples moving outward from my own. I had spent years thinking my story was lonely. Turns out it was a chorus. Isabel walked me to the car afterward. She wore flats instead of heels and had taken off her blazer. I keep thinking about something you said, she murmured. What's that? That some truths don't need echoes. She smiled softly. But I think some do. They need to be heard again and again until they sink into the bones of the people who forgot them. I looked at her. And are you remembering now? She nodded. Every day. Then she hugged me. Not the ceremonial hug of a CEO and a respected elder. Not a performance. A daughter's hug. 2 days later, I received an envelope from the foundation. Inside, a list of the first 10 women selected for the Quiet Architect Fund. Beside each name was a single sentence they'd written in their application. One read, I dedicate this to my mother who taught me to balance both books and boundaries. Another, to the woman who never spoke of her sacrifices but wore them like medals no one saw. And another still, my mentor never had a LinkedIn profile. But she's the reason I exist. I held the paper against my chest for a long time. Later that night, Isabel called. No agenda, no reason. Just to share that she'd finally taken down the company's old tagline. Too cold, she said. We're rewriting it. What's the new one? I asked. There was a pause. Then she said, built by quiet hands, guided by louder hearts. I smiled. Sounds familiar? I thought it might, she said, laughing. Before bed, I sat by my window and lit another candle. And I imagined that somewhere some young woman was opening her acceptance letter, that she'd smile and cry, and maybe look up at the person beside her, the one with tired eyes and a worn coat, and say, you're the reason this happened. That alone was worth all the invisible years. Late that summer, Isabel invited me on a trip. Not far. Just a weekend retreat hosted by her company at a restored vineyard estate, a place where executives went to unplug and recalibrate, as she called it. I'll have a +1 spot, she said. You could come as my guest. No panels, no speeches. Just walk the gardens with me. Like we used to do. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to go, but because something in me still expected the old Isabel to resurface, the one who needed me only when no one else was available. But then she added, "We'll have a cottage to ourselves. No schedules. Just you and me. I want to hear your stories this time." So I said yes. The vineyard was beautiful. Wildflowers spilled across the gravel path. The air smelled like lavender and oak. Our cottage had creaky floors and hand-stitched curtains, the kind of place where quiet lingers long after conversation ends. The first evening we sat on the porch, sipping herbal tea while crickets hummed their lullaby. Isabel asked, "Did you ever want more?" I looked at her puzzled. More. More than this life. Than the quiet. Than raising a daughter who forgot too many things for too long. I took a slow breath. "Yes," I said. "Sometimes." Then I looked out at the vineyard's sun setting in slow layers over the rows of vines. "But I wanted you more. I always did." She didn't speak for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and handed me a small notebook. "I've been keeping this," she said, "since the night you left the gala early." I opened it. Inside were pages of thoughts scribbled late at night, some tear-streaked, some furious, most uncertain. But among them was this entry written in bold letters. "I think my mother raised me to be brave. But I only used it to climb, not to look back. Maybe it's time I turn around." I closed the notebook and handed it back. "I'm glad you did," I said. She looked at me with that same nervous pride I remembered from her childhood recitals. "You know," she said, "I used to think love meant proving something, being useful, accomplished, exceptional. And now," I asked, "now I think love is remembering who held you when you didn't even know what you were trying to become." The next morning we walked through the vineyard path, bare feet brushing through dew-wet grass. She asked questions about my early days before the hospital job, before the co-signed loans and quiet sacrifices. I told her about my first love, a boy who painted church ceilings and never learned to say goodbye. About the time I was almost offered a scholarship in literature but turned it down because my mother got sick. About how I loved pressed flowers and jazz piano and the idea of writing a book one day. "I didn't know any of this," she said softly. "You didn't ask." Her eyes filled. "I'm asking now." We spent the afternoon in silence, journaling under the trees. I saw her writing fast, almost feverishly, pages turning like wind. She was processing, and I was letting go. Not of her, of the version of myself who had waited too long to be seen. That evening after dinner, there was a small fire pit gathering for guests. Someone passed around a question card game. When it was Isabel's turn, she pulled a card and read aloud. "Who is someone you owe a part of your identity to, but have never told properly?" She looked directly at me. "I think everyone in this vineyard knows I'm a director, a strategist, a woman in finance who climbed her way through a system built by others." She paused. "But what they don't know is, I was built by a woman who wore the same coat for 5 winters, so I could afford textbooks, who co-signed every loan and then took on the repayments when I walked away, who made me grilled cheese with real butter the night I flunked calculus and said nothing, just put her hand on my shoulder, and stayed." The air went still. "I owe everything I am to Clara Harwood," she said, "and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure that's not just true, but spoken." There was no applause, only something better. A circle of women, many with tears in their eyes, nodding silently, recognizing in me something they'd seen in their own mothers, or wished they had. That night, I slept deeper than I had in years, because the person I loved most had finally turned around and found me there, still waiting, still whole, still hers. When we returned from the vineyard, I noticed something had changed, not just in Isabel, but in the way she existed in the world. Her posture was different, less guarded. She didn't rush through conversations like she used to, didn't deflect emotion with rehearsed eloquence. She had begun to speak with weight, not just clarity. And more than that, she started inviting me into her life in a way that wasn't symbolic, but sincere. She wanted me there. One day, she brought me into her office during a company town hall meeting. I expected to sit quietly in the back like I always had. But instead, she said, "I want to introduce someone. This is my mother, Clara Harwood. She is the reason I exist in this room." And in case anyone here thinks they made it alone, ask yourself who paid the first bill that got you in the door. The applause wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It felt earned. For both of us. Weeks later, she asked me to help her write the opening speech for the Quiet Architect Fund's second cycle. Why me? I teased. You're the writer now, she grinned. Because you're the architect. I'm just building with your blueprints. We sat together at her kitchen table for hours, editing sentences, debating over phrases, arguing gently about tone. She wanted it firm. I wanted it soft. She wanted to be clear. I wanted to be kind. We met in the middle. The final line we wrote together read, "Some people build empires. Others build the people who build empires. We remember them both." Then came something I hadn't expected. She asked me to write a foreword for her upcoming book, a memoir about leadership legacy and the unspoken support behind success. At first I laughed. Why would anyone care what I think? She looked at me stunned. Because if you don't speak, I'm not real. That silenced me. And then it moved me. So I wrote the foreword. I kept it short, honest, human. I spoke about teaching Isabel how to read balance sheets on the back of junk mail. About the nights we shared one bowl of soup and made it a game of pretend we're in Paris. About the time I sold my last piece of jewelry to cover a scholarship gap because she didn't get picked for the merit grant. And about how for years I waited to be acknowledged and then learned that being remembered sometimes begins when you choose to speak. The book went to print that fall, and when the first hard copy arrived, Isabel handed it to me with a smile that looked 20 years younger. Open to page 1, she said. I did. There, beneath the dedication, for my mother, Clara Harwood, who did the math that built the miracle. I pressed the page to my chest, not because I needed the words, but because I had lived their proof. At the launch event, she brought me on stage for a quiet moment, not for applause, not for show, but because this time she wanted to stand beside me, not on top of what I had built. She handed me the mic and whispered, "Say whatever you want." So I looked at the audience of suited professionals, bright-eyed interns, journalists, and colleagues and said this: we spend so much of our lives trying not to need anyone. But strength isn't what you hold alone. It's what you carry together. And if you're lucky someone loved you so much that you forgot how hard they were working, remember them, out loud. The room stood still, then rose to its feet. And Isabel, she cried again, but this time not out of guilt, out of reverence. After the event, we walked home together. She said, "You've become a legend around here." I chuckled. "I'm just a tired woman in orthopedic shoes." "No," she said, wrapping her arm around mine. "You're the footnote I forgot to read. And now you're the headline." I looked at her smiling. "No love," I said gently. "Now I'm just a mother. And finally, that's enough." The year I turned 72, I received a letter from the university Isabel had attended. It was formal, printed on ivory paper with a gold crest embossed in the corner. At first I thought it was a mistake. Some administrative update, a data breach notification, or perhaps another alumni fundraising campaign. But when I opened it, I read, "Dear Miss Clara Harwood, in recognition of your lifelong dedication to quiet mentorship, foundational support, and intergenerational impact, we are proud to award you the Honorary Companion of Legacy Award. Your story shared through the Quiet Architect Fund has become required reading in our leadership program. We hope you will join us to accept this honor in person." I stared at the paper for a long time. Me. Required reading. Not because I'd spoken the loudest, but because I had once chosen not to speak at all, and then one day finally did. Isabel drove me to the ceremony. It was a crisp winter morning, and she'd insisted on buying me a new coat for the occasion. Soft gray wool with a high collar and deep pockets. "You look like you run the world," in that, she said. I laughed. "No, sweetheart. I just funded a small corner of it." When we arrived, she walked beside me the whole way, hand on my elbow. Not guiding me, accompanying me. There's a difference. The auditorium was full. Students, professors, guests. The sort of crowd that would have terrified me once. But now, I was unshaken. Because I wasn't there to prove anything. I was there to accept something that had always been mine. Acknowledgment. They introduced me with a short film, archival footage of the mentorship program, audio clips from my quiet architect speech, and a photograph taken secretly. I later learned of me kneeling in the attic, hands holding a file of tuition records. The narrator said, Clara Harwood never asked to be named, but she remembered everything. And in remembering, she made space for a new kind of power. I stepped onto the stage slowly, heart steady. And for the last time, I told my story, not to ask for applause, but to remind others what it means to be seen finally fully. I ended with this. There are women you will never hear about. They gave up careers, comfort, even names, to build the kind of people who write books, win awards, lead companies. They are the scaffolding, the invisible signatures. I was one of them. And now, I stand here not as an exception, but as a reminder that love can be quiet and still leave thunder behind. The standing ovation didn't move me, but Isabel's face did. She had her hand pressed over her mouth, tears streaming down both cheeks. Not out of regret, but pride. That night at home, I lit a final candle at the window. I opened the file one last time. What she finally saw. I added a closing line. The story is no longer mine alone. She carries it now, and she speaks my name. Then I clicked save. Then I closed it. And this time it stayed closed. Because after a lifetime of receipts, silence, and sacrifice, I had finally been paid in full. We spent our lives writing stories we think no one will read. We tuck away sacrifices in desk drawers. We file memories in silent corners. We hand over years, sometimes decades of our lives in quiet service to others. And we hope somewhere deep inside that one day, someone will turn around, not to apologize, not to repay, but simply to say, I see you now. This was never a tale of revenge. There was no courtroom, no confrontation, no dramatic ultimatum in a storm. Only a mother aging gracefully, carrying the invisible weight of everything she gave, and a daughter blinded by ambition, then humbled by truth, who finally learned how to look backward without shame. Their reunion didn't happen all at once. It happened in teaspoons. In old photos, rewritten speeches, a shared loaf of bread. In a hug that lasted longer than pride. In a letter that arrived later than expected, but still in time. This is what healing can look like. It's not always loud. It's not always pretty. And it doesn't always include the words, I'm sorry. But sometimes it includes something better. Recognition, legacy, a name spoken without hesitation. Clara Harwood never raised her voice. She raised a daughter, then raised a generation. And in the end, the world didn't just remember her. It stood for her. To the mothers, grandmothers, caretakers, and quiet architects everywhere. Your sacrifices matter. Your names deserve to be remembered. And your love, though quiet, has built empires. We see you now, and we will not forget.